To review all these stories are journalists Joe Phillips and Nabila Ramdani. Lovely to have you both with us on the programme. So let's start, if we can, with Vietnam, which has unfortunately recorded its first coronavirus cases since April. It had been praised as a huge success story, having no deaths from coronavirus. So Nabila, what do you think it did right and what might have changed?
Well, there are all kinds of coronavirus spikes at the moment in all kinds of very popular tourist destinations, including Spain. But what's happening in Vietnam is of particular concern because it was seen as a great COVID-19 success story. And nobody had died there, as you rightly said, and there were only 400 cases. Now, however, areas are being shut to tourists altogether, and some 80,000 visitors to Da Nang, the central coastal city, are to be sent home. Most of these are Vietnamese, but foreigners will be becoming very wary as well. And this all shows that we are by no means out of the woods as far as coronavirus is concerned. We are starting to see that this horrific disease is something that we could live for a very long time to come, especially if there is no success with a vaccine, which is very possible indeed. And unlike many countries, Vietnam acted early on the pandemic before it even had confirmed cases, and it recognized that it didn't have the resources to tackle a widespread infection. So instead, it did everything to keep the virus out altogether, and this included closing its borders to almost all travelers except returning citizens, and it required anybody returning the country to quarantine in government facilities for 14 days and undergo testing. Now, most of the cases in Vietnam have actually been detected in quarantine. And there was also an extensive contact tracing and testing operation that meant that it was the country was able to quash local outbreaks.
And Joe, in this latest round of cases, Vietnam has taken very strong action, expelling 80,000 tourists. Some people have called it an overreaction. What do you think?
Well, I think, as Nabila's just said, they acted fast, they acted decisively before they'd even got any confirmed cases, and they were held up really as an exemplar of a country that had dealt with coronavirus. And I think they're probably taking the same approach. And I think in this hideous pandemic, which knows no borders, that is the only thing you can do, is to move people back, stop the concentration of people. We understand that the 80,000 people who are being evacuated are domestic tourists as opposed to foreign tourists, because it's, as you said, it's a very popular coastal resort. But, it's worked before. I think what's interesting is that it appears that this is a different strain. Some reports are saying, well, that hasn't yet been confirmed, but it seems like it's a different strain that hasn't yet been identified in Vietnam.
Well, we'll keep a close eye on what's going on over there, certainly. Let's move on now to our second story, which is Britain unveiling its Better Health campaign, calling on Brits to lose weight. Much of the impetus behind this has been the link between COVID-19 and obesity. And Joe, one of the points in the plan is that doctors can now prescribe exercise. Do you think that's something that's really necessary?
Well, doctors have always, or for many years, have been able to prescribe exercise and other forms of what's called social prescription. The UK has been known as the fat man of Europe for about 10 years. We've got 1 in 4 adults are obese and 1 in 5 children. It costs the health service an absolute fortune, and we know now there is an indisputable link between the effects of COVID-19 and obesity. It's absolutely, one of the things that successive governments have tried to deal with, and all have failed. Boris Johnson, as you said earlier, Robin, is, he's going to ban advertising of junk food before 9 o'clock in the evening. And there'll be a crackdown on the buy one, get one free on unsuitable food. But at the same time, the government has been selling off school playing fields. We had the row, as you may remember, about free school meals for children during the summer holidays, which the government only did a U-turn on after the intervention of the footballer Marcus Rashford. And there's always the question about the lack of and access to fresh fruit and vegetables and cheaper food for people who are living in deprived areas. You know, fresh fruit and vegetables are very expensive if you don't live near a shop that it's readily available. Now, we've seen during the lockdown, lots of people have taken to gardening, lots of people have taken to cooking. One of the things that I think needs to happen is that people need to be taught how to cook, and we probably need to think about compulsory school meals, where at least you know that you can control the intake of a child's diet from one healthy meal a day. You know, but the government is also paying money for people to go out in order to bolster the hospitality industry, and the restaurants or the diners that have signed up to that are all the fast food takeaways. So, you know, it's mixed messages again from Boris Johnson's government, I'm afraid.
And Nabila, some might say that Boris Johnson is doing this now because he's gone on his own well-publicised fitness drive and is effectively saying, well, I can do it, why can't you?
Well, I must say that it's very strange indeed to see a character like Boris Johnson leading a Keep Fit campaign. You can accuse him of a lot of things, but being a Keep Fit fanatic is not one of them. He has always been he has always looked extremely well fed, and he played on this part of his Billy Bunt charm for many years. But more seriously, we must remember that he was gravely ill with coronavirus earlier this year. He came horribly close to death, and he more than anyone now knows the critical importance of keeping your weight down and keeping your heart healthy. So it's not just about exercise, but it's also about eating good things. And we spent most of this year discussing and worrying about health in relation to coronavirus. So I think it's a very good thing that the dangers of junk food and the lack of exercise are now being highlighted. And one of the most dangerous aspects of contracting COVID-19 is doing so when you are obese. And as Mr. Johnson said, the best way to prepare for the possibility of contracting the virus is to get as fit and healthy as possible. And I often compare Britain and France, where there is no buy one, get one free culture of junk food. You don't get a free chocolate bar with your newspaper, for example, or vendor machines are more stocked with water and fruit than they are with sugary snacks and fizzy drinks in airports and train stations, for example. School menus in canteens in schools are approved by the French government. So there's a lot more state interference when it comes to tackling obesity in France than there currently is in the UK.
OK, well, let's move on now to a very different kind of leader, which is the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, who has got a huge lead in the latest polls ahead of the September general election. It's the highest in poll history. I want to ask both of you, do you think it's personality or is it policies? Let me start with you, Jo.
Well, I think it's both. I mean, she was elected a few years ago, and 2017, she's in a coalition government, and the figures on the latest polling show that if the polls come true in the election in September, she could actually lead a government of her own without being in coalition. But in the time that she has been Prime Minister, she had to deal with the Christchurch massacre and also, of course, coronavirus. Now, she's held up by many. And actually, before I came on air tonight, I was looking at some of the academic research that's been done into her as an exemplar of a leader. You know, she's very, very clear on how she deals with things in a crisis. She comes across, you know, with great empathy, but she's also got clarity and she's very decisive. You know, she made a decision early on how New Zealand was going to deal with coronavirus. She stuck to it. And a lot of people hold her up. I mean, we know, actually, that, you know, in many countries around the world where they have got women leaders, they have dealt with coronavirus much more successfully. And New Zealand is like that. I mean, they're calling it, you know, stardust that she's got. She's certainly got great charisma. She's young, she's attractive, she's got a small child. But I think in the end, it comes down to the fact that she is a brilliant communicator. You know, whether or not she can hold on to that in the polls, who knows? We know what happens. You know, polls are often wrong when it comes to the election, but she looks like she's on for a decisive victory in a few weeks' time.
Nabila, what do you think? What does she have that others don't have?
Yes, I think, well, I'm not surprised at all that Jacinda Ardern is still doing so well in the polls and indeed extending her lead. She's interesting in that she's built up a very high international profile, which is what most successful politicians do nowadays. And in Mrs. Ardern's case, she became very well known initially during her the absolute horror, as Joe said, of the Christchurch terrorist attacks last year when a gunman killed 51 people in 2 mosques. The attack changed the political landscape of New Zealand, and it led to a sweeping gun reform and a royal commission inquiry. But I think it's Mrs. Ardern's dignity and courage that was mostly noted for everybody to see during her response to the crisis, especially in the way she brought communities together. Her popularity is now at an all-time high due to her response to the coronavirus pandemic. New Zealand has just had over 1,000 COVID-19 cases and only 22 deaths. But very early on, New Zealand began, taking very drastic measures, such as banning entries to any foreigners. And they were the strictest regulations in the world. But
yeah, she's certainly been very effective when it comes to coronavirus, hasn't she? Let me just ask you briefly then about our last story, which is the resurgence of sleeper trains. France being one of the countries that's renewing old routes. Nabila, would you go on a sleeper train? What's the appeal, do you think?
Oh, most definitely. I think trains are, of course, traditionally seen as a far more civilized alternative to air travel. And this story is not surprising at all. I mean, coronavirus has made us wary of all kinds of places, but I think the inside of a plane is the worst. One thing that has surprised me is the way that airplanes still fill up all their seats, whereas many train services are leaving an empty seat between everyone. So trains may take longer than planes, but if you can get your own clean sleeping compartment, then using trains instead of planes makes a great deal of sense, in my view. And you do not need to sit around in a departure lounge before getting on a train. And of course, you can walk around once you're on board. But I think the thought of making the journey from Paris to Berlin, for example, via an overnight train certainly sounds to me preferable than taking a plane at the moment. And I'm not aware of any night trains going through the Channel Tunnel, but perhaps it's something the operators should think about.
And Joe, just briefly, would you take a sleeper train? It's also a very green idea, isn't it?
Absolutely. I went on a sleeper train many years ago from Paris to Prague, and it was absolutely wonderful. And I couldn't work out what this particularly peculiar little thing beside the top of my bunk was. And it was a sort of velvet blob really stuck on the wall. And I asked the guard when she came round, and she said to me rather disdainfully, "Madam, it's for putting your jewellery on so it doesn't rattle during the night," which I thought was utterly romantic. And I've been looking at some of these routes, these overnight routes. How much nicer than hanging around at an airport. And as Nabila said, you can take your time, you can look out of the window, much more relaxing, much more romantic.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're going to have to leave it there, but very lovely thoughts of romantic train journeys. Joe Phillips and Nabila Ramdani, many thanks indeed.